I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. There is a question that underlies nearly every conversation I've encountered recently about politics or about our democracy. It's the question that seems to be on every American's mind right now. And the question is, will we have free and fair elections? And the short answer is yes. Yes, we will. We have important mayoral races this year, gubernatorial races, special elections, elections to decide important ballot measures, all happening this year. But they are happening at a time when casting your ballot is getting harder and harder. Today's guest, Rebekah Caruthers, president of the Fair Elections Center, helps us unpack what's at stake and how the barriers we see today are deeply rooted in our nation's history. From Reconstruction-era black codes that were designed to silence black voters, to modern laws that continue to strip people of their rights. Rebekah reminds us that voter suppression has always evolved. It's just taken on new forms. But we also talk about solutions, how participation, vigilance, and civic education can strengthen our democracy and push us closer to the more perfect union that we all want. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Rebekah Caruthers. Rebekah Caruthers, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk about this topic with you and your audience today.
So, National Voter Education Week was earlier this month, and part of that effort is voter registration and voter registration drives. And I read recently that the percentage of eligible Americans who are registered to vote hovers around 70% or 73%. And that's actually higher than I expected because typically turnout is around 60 to 65%. But I guess my question is, why are so many Americans still not registered to vote? Because we have these registration drives year over year. So what's the barrier there?
So it's interesting that you talk about where turnout is. And like that turnout is the percentage of those who actually register. So it's not even 60 to 65% of the total population or the voting age population that's voting. So when you already have, like in the 70s, percentage of Americans registering to vote, and then of that, you don't even have 70% of those who register to vote to actually turn out to vote. That shows that we have some barriers, that we have some issues, that there's some tension in the system that's making voting less desirable for folks. So when we think about the barriers to register to vote, a lot of times it's confusion. And for some people who don't want as many people as possible who are eligible to vote, then they're fine with that confusion. In that Fair Election Center, we try to provide education to make it as least confusing as possible. So those who are eligible to vote, who want to vote, are able to get registered and then actually able to cast their ballot.
I think what's confusing for me is that I understand the barriers to actually voting, especially if you're in a state where they don't have mail in ballots. And I think half the country don't have access to mail in ballots. I think there's like 24 or 25 states that don't. I understand the barriers there. There's childcare, there's working, there's access to a ballot place because I think tens of thousands of ballot locations have closed over the past decade or so, right? But I've never fully understood the barrier to actually registering because it's a form, right? In some places you can just go online. Is it mostly young people in college, students who never voted before or never registered before, or is it across all demographics?
So, across all demographics, so how you register to vote depends on the state. Some states allow for automatic voter registration, meaning that you get a state ID or you get a driver's license, you'll automatically be asked if, hey, do you want to go ahead and register to vote? There are some states that allow for online voter registration. But in all of these states that have these different rules, you also have the layer of voter ID. So when people register to vote, they have to attest that they are who they are. They have to be able to prove who they are in order to register to vote. And then the barrier happens when people go try to cast their ballot. They have to use the ID and all the other stuff. So now there's more friction in the process. But just spending time here focusing on the actual voter registration and how it varies by state. There are some states that have different requirements of what you have to bring in order to attest that you are eligible to be a duly registered person in that particular state. There are some states that have signature requirements. So if you're in a state that has a signature requirement and you are trying to do automatic voter registration, but then you're also trying to do online voter registration with that, then you have to have a signature on file with the DMV. And you have a signature on file with the DMV, then you have to consent to let them pull that signature and use it to complete your application for a state. But the issue with that, there are people who don't have a driver's license. And guess what? You don't have to have a driver's license in this country. We're seeing a lot of Gen Z saying, you know what? Uber or Lyft, I don't need these problems, or they're waiting for the driverless vehicles to really hit the market. So they have no interest. If you ask a Gen Zer and you ask them, hey, so do you want to learn how to drive? More than likely, they're going to tell you no. So, what's happening when you have people like that who aren't interacting with the Department of Motor Vehicles? That means there's no signature to pull. It also means that they're not being brought into the voter registration process. And so we just released a report to remind lawmakers that not everybody's going to go to the DMV or interact with the DMV. And so you have to find other ways of making sure that people are still pulled into the process and they're being asked, do you want to register to vote? So if they're using other state resources or having interactions with other state departments, then maybe those departments should be asking that question too, so we could get as many people as possible who would be interested in registering to vote to register to vote. Then we also see those states where you have in person voter registration. And you have to think about rural areas.
Mhm.
All kinds of people live in rural areas, young, old, Democrat, Republican, Black people, white people, Latinos, Indigenous, Asian, all sorts of people live in rural areas. But because resources are finite, you might only have one county office that's able to do the voter registration. And that county office may not be open Monday through Friday from 9 to 5. And even if it is open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, that person, what incentive do they have to leave school or leave their job to take time off to go register to vote in person? And so those are the types of things that causes more friction in the process. And the more friction you have, you're going to have a higher drop off rate.
I'm glad you mentioned that word friction. There's actually a study that came out recently about voter friction and how it isn't considered often enough when we think about barriers for people to vote. But as many barriers as there are, and as varied as those barriers are, there's a new layer that I think was introduced probably over the past 10 years, maybe, and that's fear. When you start talking about people bringing their papers, proving who they are, there's a certain political faction that has made us all think that there's something nefarious happening with voter registration and with voting if you don't have the right ID. If you go to vote and you don't have the ID, it's fine. You can turn around and you can go home. But I think that this language that has been used around voters trying to do something nefarious has really put a lot of fear in people. And I wonder if you've seen that play out in these voter registration drives.
Absolutely. And then when you add states like Georgia, and you add states like Florida doing different things to make it harder for community organizations to register their friends, family, and neighbors to vote. When you see that there's now interjections of things to criminalize parts of the process when it comes from either voter registration or even assisting people with their ballot, aka you have an elderly neighbor who filled out their vote by mail and you're dropping it off for them. If you help three of your neighbors in Florida, it is now a felony. You can't help more than two people and assist them this way. So when those things happen, and then you have an increase in misinformation, and misinformation is simply incorrect information. Sometimes people get stuff wrong and they go run and tell it on social media. But then you have disinformation, is where you have an intentional targeting of certain populations with false information to get them to believe it and to spread it. That's what we're seeing with the uptick in would be voters not having proper information and that leading to them deciding not to vote. Because as you mentioned earlier, when you interject friction into the voting process, friction into the voter registration process, you're going to have people who want to do these things, but then they drop off because each little piece of friction builds up a barrier to voting, builds up a barrier to registering to vote.
And that is precisely the way it was intended to work among people who are trying to increase barriers to vote, to increase voter suppression. It's working exactly the way they designed it. And that's really unfortunate to see. And like I said, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety. And one of the areas of anxiety that I've been seeing is particularly online are people who are afraid that we will not have free and fair elections ever, right? And I always remind people that we're having them every week, right? There's there's probably tens of thousands. I think there are tens of thousands of elections just this year alone. That's before next year, the midterms.
100,000.
100,000, really? It's that high?
Yes, there's 100,000 seats and initiatives that's on the ballot this year. In fact, early voting has started in several states. 46 states have some level of voting because people have to remember it's not just federal, meaning presidential or the Congress, the House, or the Senate. But you also have statewide elections. You have local elections. You have hyper local, meaning you have county, and then you have utility district, and then you have school board, you have aldermen, you have city council. You have so many different layers and political jurisdictions in this country. And so there's so many opportunities for people to be able to vote. But what's interesting from what you're seeing online, there is this real thought of, are we going to still have free and fair elections? And I'm firmly saying, absolutely, we will have free and fair elections, and Fair Election Center will be at the forefront of making sure that this constitutional right is recognized. A lot of times we tell people, oh, this is the most consequential election of your lifetime. Guess what? Every single election is important. So it's not that 2024 was even more important than 2022, when 2022 was even more important than 2020. But each time there's an opportunity to use your voice in a collective manner to determine the path that this country should go, that's important. That's some very important stuff. So at Fair Election Center, we're nonpartisan. We firmly have the belief that anyone who's eligible to vote and who wants to vote should be able to vote, which is why we are doubling down on defending, expanding, and facilitating voting rights in this country.
I think one of the best ways to ensure that you have access to the ballot and that democracy is strengthened is to participate in democracy every chance you get. So that means finding out where those, you can't find out where all 100,000 elections are, but I guarantee you there's something happening in your state. There's school board elections, there are local elections, there are ballot initiatives that are on the ballot that are really important. I've done a few episodes on ballot initiatives. There are elections happening everywhere. So just don't sleep on these quote unquote off years and wait for the midterms. You should actually participate every chance you get. Do you know if there's a correlation between the percentage of eligible Americans who are registered and the turnout percentage? Because when I've looked at the data, there's always this 10-point delta. So if we get more people registered, can we expect to have higher turnout?
So it depends, right? So, one of the things that we're noticing is that it's not enough to make sure that people get registered to vote. We're now in a cycle of where you have to actively check your voter registration and confirm that you indeed are eligible to vote for this upcoming election. So, Mississippi is one of those states where you get registered to vote, you're preparing to vote, and you have your plan to vote. But then, say you find out that there's something that's wrong with your voter registration. You moved, but you didn't fix your address in their system. So you go to the local elections office and you update your address. Well, guess what? Depending on what time of year you do it, if you do it after the deadline, you're no longer eligible to vote in that particular election. You got to wait till the next time to vote in order to vote. So things like that is dependent upon state. And so that means that people should monthly just go ahead and check your voter registration. It's one reason why you have National Voter Education Week, because we're letting people know, hey, you got to check it. Like we saw in Georgia, they just kicked 500,000 people off the rolls. And some of the justification was, oh, they haven't voted in a long time. The right to vote is a constitutionally protected right. Even if you don't use it, that's not you waving the flag and say, I'm abdicating my constitutional right to vote. But you have some states who have those types of schemes of creating more friction in the process. Barriers are real. People really have to use their sphere of influence because your influence is real, and making sure you learn those around, hey, double check your voter registration. At Fair Election Center, we've had to do so many lawsuits in the state of Wisconsin because they're constantly doing voter purges where they're removing people off of the voting rolls. And sometimes those people don't even know what happened. And then they try to go vote and they can't vote. And they're told, oh, you don't have an active voter registration.
So you said, I want to go back to Georgia. She said Georgia this year, 500,000 people were removed from the
Yeah,
rolls
this summer.
just this
Yes,
summer because they
yes,
do it all the time.
absolutely. But 500,000.
Yeah.
It's a large number,
Yeah.
but those things are happening, and it's the reason why I mentioned Wisconsin too, versus Georgia is some people think, "Oh, this is just something that happens in the South." No, this is something that happens across the entire country. Having friction and barriers to vote is not just a Republicans just do it or Democrats do it or they suppress. This is a thing that happens. Sometimes it's human error, and you have local election folks who misapply state regulation or state law, but sometimes it's a concerted effort to shrink down eligible voters in this country. And so people have to be aware that there are people in this country who do not want you to vote. So guess what? You ought to go vote. Because if they're working that hard and they're like, oh, I don't want this person to vote. I even say this to communities of color, especially Black communities. Sometimes Black communities are told, well, your ancestors died and bled for the right to vote. You should go vote. That messaging isn't effective. The messaging that is effective is, why is your demographic specifically told that your vote doesn't matter, that your vote doesn't count, but other demographics aren't told that? You should really question that, and you should really double down and make sure you're voting. Because why are they only telling you this and not everybody that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know what? I'm gonna change my own rhetoric because I say that all the time. I say people died for my rights, and that's true. And I think about that every time I think, oh, I live in a state where there's vote by mail, so I have no excuse to not vote. But if I'm ever feeling apathetic, I'm reminded of that. But anyway,
And most states do offer vote by mail. Some states it's through absentee ballot. Some states have early in person, meaning you have to go during the early voting period. They'll print out a ballot and then you could vote and then you could just turn it into them directly. So you're not actually putting it in the mail. But most states allow for that to happen. The big change happened in 2020 during the pandemic. And that's where you saw the states who weren't as quick to adopt it prior to 2020 say, you know what, we might need to consider having more options for people to be able to vote.
absolutely. I think about the 2020 election a lot because I was looking at some data, and the 2020 election had the highest turnout in modern election history. I think it was something like 66%, which is still, which is still
It's
low
low.
compared to other nations, but it was the highest we'd had. And I think in 2024, it was the second highest. It was, I think, 65%. And I know that that turnout was so high despite voter suppression efforts because with mail in ballots, people were able to circumvent all of the voter suppression efforts. If your ballot place is closed, no problem. You can just mail in your ballot. But I'm
There's a long line.
yeah,
You
no,
could just mailing your ballot, you could vote from your couch.
absolutely, absolutely. I'm curious as to I don't want to stay on Georgia the whole time, but I'm curious as to how do you remedy something like that? So you have 500,000 people thrown off the rolls. How do you even start to remedy that aside from a lawsuit?
So lawsuits is an effective tool. So I'm an attorney and we have a team of litigators at Fair Election Center. And so when we see that folks' constitutional right to vote is being challenged or is being questioned, we examine the facts and we figure out, hey, maybe this is a good case for us to be involved in. But there are lots of great voting rights litigation organizations across the country. I think in Georgia, that particular case, I think ACLU of Georgia has filed some lawsuits around that. We have had to file lawsuits in Alabama, as an example, last fall, where there were, I think it was like over 80,000 folks who were kicked off of the rolls in Alabama and actually violated federal law under the HAVA, Help Americans Vote Act, because this happened within so many days, within 90 days of the election. And you're not, according to federal law, and this is still federal law, there's certain things that you're not supposed to do that close to an election. And so the state ended up reinstating those folks, and those who wanted to vote, they were vote eligible and they were able to cast their ballot if they so chose. And so we look for different opportunities. And like you hear me saying like an 80,000 number, even though in Georgia it was like 500,000 folks. Our elections are decided very close.
Yeah.
And so when I keep talking about the different friction, it isn't always removing 10 million people from the state of Texas off of the rolls. But if you're removing 50,000 people in Tarrant County, that's going to impact Tarrant County elections. Tarrant County is the county where Fort Worth is located. If you're removing 1,000 people from a particular district in North Carolina, I think that Cherie Beasley's race, when she ran for US Senate, I think that was decided by less than 1,000 voters. And so when we think about the friction in the system, it's meant to pick off a few voters here, a few voters there, when there's intentional friction. Now, sometimes the friction is not intentional, but there are other times where it is intentional. That's where we come in and we file a lawsuit.
Does it bother you like it bothers me when you hear people talk about voter apathy? I think it was Latasha Brown, Miss Latasha Brown, the founder of Black Voters
Like
Matter.
voters.
Yeah, she said to me a few years ago, she said, "No one's apathetic about their lives." Right. And I remember that because no one has apathy about their lives. Right. So it bothers me when people say that voters are apathetic and that's why they don't turn out. As you've just brilliantly pointed out throughout this conversation, we should really look at the barriers before we talk about people just wanting to sit home and, binge Netflix. That's not really what's happening. Like maybe it happens in some cases, but people have other issues that are keeping them from voting. So anyway, I guess the short question is does that bother you?
So it makes me challenge when people say voters are apathetic. And Latasha Brown, and shout out to Latasha and to Cliff, they're doing amazing work with Black Voters Matter. And we partner with them whenever we could partner with them. Um, it should beg a question if you have people who are saying, hey, I'm not interested in voting. Because the reality is, there are voters who are burnt out, stressed, and are apathetic. When we think about the presidential turnout last year, we had roughly a third voted for one candidate, a third of the voting population voted for another candidate, and then a third did not vote. That's a lot. And so we should be asking, what is it that's happening to those voters who choose not to vote? And it is a choice. And we can start talking about what leads up to that choice. What are we doing to encourage those voters to vote? But also, what are the barriers that makes it easy? What is the confusion that's being injected into the system that make those voters say, yeah, I care about my life. I care about those around me. I care about my community, but I'm not going to vote. Some people don't understand the power of the ballot box. Some people don't understand they don't understand the world impact of voting in those particular lines. So this year with 100,000 seats being up, those are local seats. Local seats have the greatest impact on your day-to-day life. And regardless of what executive orders or daily tweets that you may see, think about what has the greatest impact in your day to day life. It's going to be your stay in local folks. Even as we're seeing different things happen across this country with the use of federal forces in cities, which is something different that we haven't seen in the modern history in the last 50 years. Guess what? It is state and local folks who are interfacing with that. It's state and local elected officials that are interfacing, that are determining what's right for their city, what's right for their state.
And if you don't like that, you should pay attention to your local elections, see who's running this year, see who's running next year, and talk to them while they're in office now, and then see what you can do to influence them in the next election. So there is something that you can do right now. I think that a part of our conversation we just had a couple of minutes ago, we were talking about the difference between the 2020 election and the 2024 election when people started doing mail in ballots because of COVID, right? And then how that shifted the 2024 election. And that made me think about, again, my state. I live in a vote by mail state. We have automatic voter registration. And I think a lot of people don't really know what they're missing until they've experienced that, right? A lot of countries have this nationwide. They have automatic voter registration. You get a day off of work to go and vote. Everybody's registered, everybody votes. They have upwards of like 90% participation in elections. And I'm not really sure if this is a voter education issue or I know that it's a policy issue.
But what I'm hearing from you is, what is the structural issue? And I'll answer that by telling my family story. So I'm a millennial. My siblings are Gen X. Of my first cousins group in my family, despite my family being in this country for centuries, my first cousins group, we're the first born into full civil rights. I'm going to say that again. I'm a millennial.
Mhm.
My siblings are Gen Xers. We're the first in my family to be born into full civil rights, which includes voting rights, despite my family being in this country for centuries, plural centuries. We could trace back and pull records of enslavement. We could pull so many records, like a proven history of being in this country for centuries. And that's something that I want people to really think about. Or I'll say it in a different way. Next year, this country will be 250 years old. One of our family friends, she's 105. We affectionately call her Aunt Joe. We will never call her Josephine because you do not call elders by their first name. We call her Aunt Joe. Aunt Joe's 105 years old. This country is two and a half Aunt Joes.
Wow.
She has lived through about 40% of the timeline of this country. And so just like think about that. And I've been thinking about that and been sitting with that. The reason why I raise it, as we're talking about the fight for voting rights, when we talk about apathy, when we talk about access to people to be able to register to vote, and we talk about all these things, we can't be myopic and just tunnel vision on this part of history, but we got to broaden it out and understand this country. And so, if we want a country of every eligible person not only is able to vote, but is enthusiastic about voting, we got to have some real conversations of what this shrinking the voting electorate is really about. It's about silencing certain voices and not actualizing the multicultural democracy that we are. And I get it. A lot of people will say our democracy is not perfect. There's a lot of things that we don't do right, that the United States is hypocritical. Yes, yes, yes to all those things. But as long as we're a democracy, we have a path to fix that. Democracy requires two things: contestation and participation. A contest means there has to be a free and fair election. Participation means those who are eligible and who want to participate need to be able to participate. So if we want to create this more perfect union, then it's going to come through the ballot box. And that's the amendment we want the future of this country to be decided by. We don't want some of those other amendments deciding the future of this country.
So, how have your conversations with people on the ground, voters, changed, shifted, given the urgency of the political moment, right? Is this kind of exchange getting through to people? Because it did to me, because we have a similar background. I didn't actually realize that and think about that with Gen X and millennial people in your family. We are the first generations, right? So, how have your conversations shifted?
Really leaning into being nonpartisan about this. And I get some people do wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Oh, but it's one party versus another party. Both parties, both current political parties have been in power at different times, have made choices not to advance voting rights. Full stop. So this isn't one party good, one party bad thing. All of them have an abysmal record at times when it comes to voting rights. And so the best thing is when you're on the ground is be honest with people with what's going on. Don't use the rhetoric that you might hear, the partisan rhetoric, but actually answer the questions. Like when someone says, I don't understand why I should vote, they're right. I would feel that way too if I didn't have civic education, because civic education isn't taught K through 12 in this country and largely is not taught on college campuses in the way in which it could be taught. It's one reason why we have our campus vote program, where we're doing civic engagement on campuses across the country. And so it's time to be honest with folks. So, like, yeah, this is parts of our country, and democracy is messy and it's sloppy. It has left some people behind, but we also get options of engaging into democracy. And so we have to create more on ramps for people to get involved with this fight. You don't have to be an attorney like I am. You don't have to lead a national voting rights organization the way I do, but there are things you could do in your own lane, in your own field of work to help improve things, to make sure that those around you have access to information. Like on Fair Election Center's website, fairelectioncenter.org, we have voter guides and we have third party voter registration guides for all 50 states plus the District of Columbia. These are technical guides that provide information. So, like if you have a college student, or you are a college student, or you're an administrator on a campus, and a student asks you, well, can I use my campus address to register to vote? Absolutely. And you know why you can? Because Waller County, Texas got sued by Prairie View students who made sure that you could use your campus address to register to vote. And it doesn't impact your financial aid package by using your campus address to vote. And so we provide that type of technical support and accurate information, including links to your local jurisdiction. So you could verify, you could double check, you can actually look at primary sources. Because we know in a land of misinformation and disinformation, it's our job to put out accurate information.
I know that the Fair Election Center just put out a report of some policy wishes or outlined some policy preferences on your site. And one of them was students, college students being able to use their address, college students be able to use their student ID to register to vote. How far are we from just nationally? I know we're really far from that, but I'll just ask the question anyway. From seeing this enacted nationwide, how far reaching is that right now?
So each state, according to the Constitution, each state gets to determine how they carry out elections. The thing that the federal government is responsible for is the Constitution already sets the date for presidential elections. It is always the first Tuesday following the first Monday of November every 4 years. It's literally in the Constitution. That's why we have those dates. And then we see the same as for midterms, where the presidential line isn't on the ballot. It follows that same date convention. So, what we have with each state determining their process with how they're going to carry out elections. Justin Jones, state rep Justin Jones from Nashville, when he was a student at Fisk, he was actually one of our plaintiffs. And the case that we sued Tennessee on was the right for students to use their college IDs as IDs for the purposes of being able to vote. And so it's a fight for each state. Like there are some states that the election administrators and the state legislatures, they really are trying to figure out how can we encourage to get more people to vote? How do we remove some of the friction from the process? And we assist those states where they're trying to defend, expand, facilitate voting rights. And sometimes they don't get it right. And we provide technical assistance of like, hey, we know what you're trying to do, but if you do that, you're actually going to disenfranchise people. But then you have other states who, in record, and the record we're able to pull through discovery from lawsuits, that they are looking for ways to intentionally shrink down the number of eligible voters. Going back to Tennessee, Tennessee is one of those states when it comes to rights restoration, because we do some lawsuits, so we help those who are returning citizens, aka convicted felons, who want to restore their right to vote. But there are some states where you have something called like a civil death, a civic death, where you can get your right restored. Other states will say, okay, it depends on what class of felony you convicted. Here's a certain class of felony. We will never give you your rights back. Tennessee is a state. When you look at just the adult population of Black Americans in Tennessee, off the top, 1 out of 5, so that's 20%, are ineligible to vote.
Wow.
So before you get to voter registration, getting people, all that stuff, just 20% of the voting age population of Black Americans in Tennessee cannot vote. And part of it is their system of removing and stripping people's rights. Mississippi is one of those states where there are certain felonies, if you're convicted of, you will forever lose your right to vote. But guess when that first started? This wasn't back in 1776 where we did those things. It was right after Reconstruction. You had black codes, and some of the black codes were targeted to make sure that the freed black men weren't able to vote. So the state of Mississippi, and there's books you can read about this, they determine what are the felonies that black men are likely to be convicted of. Not necessarily likely to have committed, but to be convicted of. And that same list of the top felonies that Black men were likely to be convicted of was a list of felonies that would permanently strip them from the right to vote.
First of all, I'm from Tennessee. I'm from Memphis. I grew up in Memphis.
Okay.
I did not know that Tennessee was you call it civic death, right? A civic death
Yep.
state, right? I did not realize that. And that's a really high percentage, 20%.
Right off the top.
And also didn't know about the Justin Jones story, which is really really great. But I'm just going to let you talk. Because I'm learning so much. I did not know that. So, it's funny. Earlier in our conversation, you said that people like to make the divisions between the North and the South, but we do see more of this kind of stuff, specifically because of what you mentioned, the Black codes happening in Southern states. Right. And they're ongoing. And because you disenfranchise people, you remove large swaths of the population from being able to vote there. They can't vote for better circumstances for themselves, specifically in exercising their right to vote. So what do you do in circumstances like that? What do you do about states like that?
So, historically, when you look at the South and when you look at the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, Section 3, Section 2. So basically, Section 3 is guns, Section 5 is guns, Section 2, the Supreme Court is doing a rehearing of the oral arguments next week. And so we assume that they're going to get rid of Section 2. It used to be if you were in a suspect jurisdiction, and by suspect jurisdiction, historically, you discriminated on the basis of race with people being able to vote in your area. Before you could make any material changes, meaning change the process for getting registered, change polling locations, you had to seek pre clearance from the Department of Justice. Pre clearance means you had to get permission and you had to affirmatively prove to the Department of Justice that the change is needed and that there is no racial discrimination as a result of the change. And so, because that provision is no longer there with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, because specifically, Roberts said, well, people got to prove that this is still needed. And if it's really needed, then the formulas need to be fixed. And if the formulas need to be fixed, Congress needs to fix it. So he kicked it back to Congress. Okay. But immediately, what we've seen is all of those jurisdictions now have new laws on the book. They either introduce the laws immediately, but in most of those jurisdictions, they have adopted laws that make it harder for people who have been historically marginalized from being able to vote and to properly register to be able to register. Georgia is one of those states. Tennessee is one of those states. There's also jurisdictions in the North that were also suspect jurisdictions. That's why I keep saying, hey, this wasn't just a Southern thing. Because I'm from the Midwest, because both sides of my family during the Great Northern Migration, both sets of grandparents, they decided Omaha. That's a different story. Why? Out of all the Northern or Midwest places they could go, they went to Omaha. But alas, I love my hometown. So the reason why I keep telling people, hey, this is not just a Southern thing, because we've seen issues in California. We've seen issues in quote unquote progressive areas. There has been different challenges in states like Washington State or Oregon, even though that they're largely getting it right and doing a lot of great things. But I don't want people to assume because they're quote unquote in a blue state that voter suppression isn't happening. Like, please don't assume that because the ideology of saying voters shouldn't be able to pick their elected officials, but elected officials should determine who their particular voters are, that ideology is across the country. I need people just to be aware. So that's why I'm being very careful as I've been doing media lately to let folks know, oh no, there's problems all across the country. There's problems in New York. So people need to understand that because we have to stay vigilant. It shouldn't depend on your zip code, but whether or not you can actually have your full right to vote. But largely, that is what we're seeing right now.
Absolutely. And I just want to go back to you were talking about the sections of the Voting Rights Act. You were referring to Shelby County versus Holder, which
Mhm.
I think gutted the Voting Rights Act by removing sections 4 and sections 5 for
The
clearance.
pre-clearance
Right.
and the formulas. Yep.
Right, exactly. And what was I think the stopgap following that was Section 2, which protects voters from racial discrimination. And that case is coming up. I know all of this because I just did an episode with the ACLU on this. That case, Calais versus Landry, which could remove Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is what protects us from racial discrimination in voting. And that's actually really scary. So I just wanted to give people a little background on that.
And redistricting, and it
Mm,
specifically, Section 2 also speaks to state and local.
yeah.
So Tarrant County, which is, I talked about Tarrant County a little bit earlier. People should pay attention. There's been redistricting and people getting kicked out of even county commission seats. So this isn't just a congressional seats or state house seats, but do we really want to get into this doom loop of where your local utilities district is now redistricting just randomly?
Yeah.
Like that's our system isn't built to sustain stuff like that. And from a public policy perspective, it's nonsensical. Why are we doing these things? Largely, it's been that you didn't have mid decade redistricting. The only time that would happen is if there was an error. It was improperly drawn in a way that decreased minority representation, or there literally was an error in which it was drawn. Instead, those exceptions are now the rule, and by exception of redrawing, and like, okay, we don't like the outcome, so now we're going to just redraw the districts and we're going to do it ad nauseum. That's a problem. So when we even talk about people no longer wanting to participate in the process, that's the type of thing that would have someone say, I don't think my vote is really going to count.
Right.
And people are going to be apathetic when those things happen.
And I think this is probably somewhat behind the questions of will we have free and fair elections? Because technically, they aren't really fair. I mean, are they free? Sure, I guess. Yeah. But are they fair? And I guess we could split hairs there about what people mean when they say, are we going to have free and fair elections? We will have elections, right? But there is an increasing interest in suppressing people's votes, right? As you pointed out throughout this
And we
conversation.
are fighting to make sure that these elections are fair.
Yeah.
And the Constitution is on our side in that fight.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, is there, if people are listening, aside from participating in democracy by voting and registering to vote and checking their voter registration, I wish we didn't have to do this, but check it often, right? What are some of the top things that people can be doing right now? What are your top 3 things that you would suggest people do right now?
Make sure you have a physical copy of the Constitution. Don't just rely on Googling it. This is also, I think, National Banned Book Week as well. Make sure that you're reading and understanding the history of this country. I hear a lot of people saying, oh, we've never been here before. Actually, we have. We've been here several times. And this time, as we confront whatever period in this nation in which we're in, we need to look at some of those solutions that were ignored before and figure out ways to actually make this country reflective of the people who live here. Because at the end of the day, people can have differences of opinion, and that's fine. They can have different thoughts on policy, and you know what? That's okay. That's the point. But we still have to make sure that the system is as fair as possible, where there isn't thumbs placed in our system. And so we have to find ways to remove barriers and create less friction in our system so people can actually count on what's happening, understanding the integrity of our election system. So please follow us on social media, Fair Election Center. Please go out to our website. We put out really great policy papers. We provide primary sources so you understand where we got our information from. So I would say it's really important for people to really educate themselves, understand civic engagement isn't just voting, it's not just voter registration, but it's ways of being in community and using collective actions to make the world around us better.
Hmm. So, one quick question: why a physical copy? Because I don't even have a physical copy of the Constitution, and I should have one.
I'm going to say this in the most nonpartisan way.
Okay,
Digital copies can be changed.
got it. That's what I thought,
Have
but
a physical copy to make sure that you can read it for yourself and you can understand it for yourself. Don't rely on a Google or other search engine search and look at the first populated entry that's an AI summary. You actually need to read it for yourself.
wow. Well, on that note, Rebekah Caruthers, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so glad we had this conversation. I learned so much. We went in directions I didn't expect, and I'm smarter for it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to your audience.